The wind had a particular meanness to it in that town. A dry, scouring spite that lifted grit from the street and flung it into the eyes of the unwanted. Lena felt it on her chapped lips, in the fine layer of dust that settled on the shoulders of her threadbare coat. It clung to her like a second skin of shame. She stood on the railway platform, a stillness at the center of the town's unblinking gaze. On either side of her, her sons, Samuel and Jacob, were small, silent anchors, their hands clutching the fabric of her skirt. Jacob, the younger, had his face buried in the folds, while Samuel, older by 2 years, stood straight, his chin set with a fragile imitation of a man's defiance. His eyes, too big for his face, darted from the saloon doors to the mercantile, catching the flicker of curtains and the quick, dismissive glances. They were a triptych of grief and exhaustion, framed by the raw pine of the station platform. The notice she had answered, pinned to a board 100 miles east, had felt like a splinter of light in a suffocating darkness. Cook and housekeeper wanted. Isolated ranch. Fair wage. It had not mentioned the need to stand trial before an entire town first. The murmurs came on the wind, thin as whispers from ghosts. A widow. From back east. With baggage. The word hung in the air, heavy and foul, and she knew it meant her sons. It meant the poverty that had worn the soles of their shoes to paper and the color from her cheeks. She did not look up. She focused on the splintered wood beneath her worn boots, counting the cracks, tracing the lines of gray, weathered grain. To look up was to meet their eyes, the women in their starched bonnets, the men leaning against posts with toothpicks in their mouths and judgment in their hearts. To look up was to drown in their certainty of her failure. So she held her piece of ground, an island in a sea of contempt, and waited for the man who had posted the notice, or for the earth to simply swallow them whole. A shadow fell over them first, long and sharp in the afternoon sun. It was a reprieve from the glare, a momentary coolness. She did not move, but she felt Samuel stiffen beside her, his small hand tightening its grip. The shadow belonged to a man. He was tall, built of the same hard, unforgiving material as the land itself. His coat was a long, dust-colored duster, his boots scuffed and grayed. He stopped a few feet away, and the murmuring of the town seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Lena risked a glance, not at his face, but at his hands. They were large, cracked, the knuckles swollen from work and cold. They hung loose at his sides, carrying no threat, only a deep, settled weariness. He carried whole winters in his eyes. When he finally looked at her, it was not with the hungry curiosity or pity she had come to expect. It was a flat, assessing gaze, like a man checking a fence line for breaks. He took in her frayed collar, the pale, hollowed look of her boys, the single, battered carpet bag at her feet that held all they owned in the world. Section I am Elias Thorne. You are the woman who answered the advertisement. His voice was low, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards rough with disuse. It was not a question. Lena found her own voice, a thin, dry thing. I am. Lena Hale. These are my sons, Samuel and Jacob. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his gaze dropping to the boys. Jacob peeked out from her skirt, one wide, fearful eye taking in the stranger. Elias Thorne did not smile, but some of the harshness in his face seemed to soften, the lines around his eyes deepening with something other than sunlight and sorrow. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over the watching town. He did not need to raise his voice. The position is filled. It was a dismissal. A closing of a gate. The whispers did not stop, but they faltered, their momentum broken by his quiet authority. He picked up her bag with one hand as if it weighed nothing. The gesture was not chivalrous, it was practical, an act of conclusion. My wagon is over here. He turned and walked away without looking back to see if she followed. For a moment, Lena remained frozen. She felt the town's gaze on her back, sharp and resentful. They had been denied the end of the show. Then Samuel tugged her hand. Mama! She drew a breath, the dusty air scraping her lungs. It was the first breath that did not feel like it was stolen. She took Jacob's hand, and with Samuel on her other side, she stepped off the platform. She was leaving the town behind, but she felt as if she were stepping off the edge of the known world, following a shadow into the vast, silent unknown. He had not freed her with a grand gesture, but with a simple, businesslike transaction. He had claimed her not as a woman, but as a solution to a problem. And for now, that was a kind of freedom she could understand. The journey was made in a silence as wide and empty as the plains that stretched out around them. The wagon creaked, a rhythmic complaint of wood and iron. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts of all they had left, settling over the sagebrush until it was uniformly gray. Elias Thorne did not speak. He handled the reins with an economy of motion. his eyes fixed on the horizon, a place that seemed to recede no matter how far they traveled. Lena sat on the buckboard beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The boys were in the back of the wagon, nestled among sacks of flour and salt, their earlier fear lulled into a weary quiet by the rocking motion. The sun beat down, a merciless hammer. After an hour, she saw Samuel's face was flushed, his lips cracked. She had a small canteen, but it held barely a mouthful of water, saved for an emergency that felt perpetually imminent. As if sensing her worry, Elias reached behind him without a word. He retrieved a large, canvas-covered canteen, uncorked it, and passed it back to the boys. "Drink," he said. The word was not a suggestion. Samuel took it, his eyes wide with surprise. He drank, then passed it to Jacob, who drank deeply, the water dribbling down his chin. Samuel corked it and held it out, but Elias just shook his head slightly. "Keep it." It was the first kindness, small and unspoken, but it landed in the barren landscape of Lena's heart like a single drop of rain. They arrived as the sun was bleeding a bruised, blood-orange light across the western sky. The ranch was not a ranch so much as a wound in the hide of the world. The house was large, a two-story clapboard structure that had once been painted white, but was now surrendering to the relentless gray of the elements. It stood against the vast emptiness, stark and alone. A barn, sturdy and well-kept, stood 100 yards away, and beyond that, a web of fences disappeared into the deepening shadows. The place was not derelict, but it was hollow. It held its breath. Elias pulled the wagon to a halt near the porch. He climbed down, his movements stiff from the long ride. "We're here." Lena gathered the boys, helping them clamber out of the wagon bed. They stood on the hard-packed earth, small and lost beside the looming silence of the house. He led them inside. The air was cool and still, smelling of wood smoke long gone cold, of dust and something else, a faint, lingering scent of lavender and absence. The main room was vast, dominated by a stone fireplace big enough to stand in, its hearth swept clean. The furniture was heavy, dark wood, shrouded in white cloths like sleeping beasts. It was the house of a man who was not living, only residing. "Your room is upstairs," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet. "And the boys," he gestured with his chin toward a closed door. "The kitchen is through there. There is food. You will find what you need." He started up the stairs, carrying her bag. She herded the boys after him, their footsteps loud on the wooden steps. He led them to a room at the back of the house. It was plain, containing a simple iron-frame bed, a washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a small chest of drawers. Next to it was a smaller room with 2 narrow cots. "This will be yours," he said, setting her bag on the floor. He did not look at her. He looked at the window, which faced east, away from the setting sun. "I do not lock my doors. You are safe here." He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. His shoulders seemed to fill the frame. "There is a grave, out past the barn. Under the cottonwood," he said it to the hallway, not to her. "That was my wife's tree." And then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hall to a room at the front of the house. The click of his door closing was a final, definitive sound. Lena stood in the middle of the room, the silence rushing in to fill the space he had left. She went to the window and looked out. The landscape was a deep, bruised purple, the first stars appearing in the vast, dark sky. Safe. The word felt foreign on her tongue. It was a promise made of actions, not words. Food in the kitchen. A room of her own. A door left unlocked not as a threat but as a statement of trust. It was an unspoken contract, written in the language of shelter and space, and it was more than she had dared to hope for. The days settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Lena rose before dawn, the house still steeped in a cool, blue darkness. She would move through the quiet kitchen, her hands rediscovering the familiar weight of an iron skillet, the rough texture of a potato sack. The fire in the cookstove was a greedy mouth she fed with splintered pine, and its eventual warmth was the first conversation of the day. She cooked for him. Biscuits, tough and serviceable at first, gradually softened as her hands remembered their craft. Stews made from salted meat and the onions and potatoes he kept in the root cellar. He would eat at the long kitchen table, his shoulders hunched, his focus entirely on the plate before him. He ate everything she put in front of him without comment, but she noticed he started leaving the table a little slower each morning, as if reluctant to abandon the small circle of warmth she created. Her sons, at first, were like mice, skittering along the edges of the rooms, their voices hushed. But the house was large and the land was larger. They began to explore. First the porch, then the dusty yard, then the vast, cathedral-like quiet of the barn. She would watch from the kitchen window as they chased grasshoppers in the tall grass or ran sticks along the fence rails, their laughter thin and reedy in the immense silence. It was the sound of life seeping back into forgotten places. He worked from sunup to sundown. She would see him from a distance, a solitary figure mending a fence line that seemed to stretch to the end of the world or riding out toward the low, hazy mountains on the horizon. He moved with a purpose that was relentless, as if he were trying to physically exhaust the grief that lived inside him. They rarely spoke. Their lives ran in parallel, their paths crossing only at the start and end of the day. But a language of gestures began to form between them. One morning, she found a stack of freshly cut firewood by the kitchen door, saving her a trip to the woodpile. She, in turn, began leaving a jar of cooled coffee and a thick slice of bread on the porch rail for him to take at midday. She mended a tear in his canvas duster, her stitches small and neat, and left it hanging on its peg. He said nothing, but the next day, a pail of fresh, frothing milk from his single dairy cow was waiting for her on the back stoop. One afternoon, she walked out past the barn, the boys trailing behind her. She found the cottonwood tree. It was old and sprawling, its leaves whispering in the constant wind. Beneath it was a single, simple wooden cross, weathered to a soft, silvery gray. The name carved into it, Eleonora, was almost worn away. The earth around it was bare and windswept. She did not know what prompted her. Perhaps it was the stark loneliness of the marker. She knelt and began to pull the stubborn weeds from the hard-packed soil. The boys, seeing her work, began to help, their small hands pulling at the dry stalks. When they were done, she found a few stubborn prairie wildflowers growing near the fence line and placed them at the base of the cross. A small splash of purple and yellow against the gray. She did not know he was watching until she stood up and turned. He was standing by the corner of the barn, his hat in his hands. His face was unreadable in the long shadows, but he did not move. He just stood there, watching her, and in his stillness she felt not an intrusion but a kind of shared acknowledgement. A quiet thank you that needed no words. The real shift came on a night when the wind turned mean, howling around the corners of the house like a hungry animal. Lena was woken by a sharp cry from the boys' room. She was out of bed in an instant, her heart pounding. She found Jacob sitting bolt upright on his cot, his face chalky in the moonlight slanting through the window. He was trembling, his breath coming in ragged sobs. "The door," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't let them lock it." It was a fear born of a cramped, shared room in a boarding house where the landlord would lock them in at night if the rent was late. A memory of helplessness. "Shoo, little one," she murmured, gathering him into her arms. "No one locks doors here. You're safe." But the terror had its teeth in him. His small body was rigid with it. The door to their room creaked open further, and Elias Thorne stood there, a lamp held aloft in one hand. The golden light pushed back the shadows, falling on the boy's terrified face. Lena expected him to be annoyed, to see this as just another burden. Instead, he walked into the room and knelt by the cot. He did not touch the boy. He just knelt there, bringing himself down to his level. "There are no locks on these doors, son," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Not on the inside. Not on the outside." He looked at Jacob, his gaze steady and calm. "This house, it needs to breathe. And so do the people in it." He reached out then, not to Jacob, but to the simple wooden frame of the cot. He ran his large, rough hand along the wood. "This is good, strong wood. It will hold you up. And the floor is strong. And the roof is strong. Nothing is getting in here that isn't welcome." Jacob's trembling began to subside. He looked from Elias's calm face to his mother's, his fear slowly receding, replaced by a weary curiosity. Elias stayed kneeling for a long moment, the lamplight carving his weathered face into planes of gold and shadow. He looked old and tired, but in his eyes there was a profound and gentle sorrow that seemed to understand the boy's fear completely. Finally he stood. "He will sleep now," he said quietly, and then he left, leaving the lamp on the floor. Its soft glow filled the room, a silent, golden promise. Lena settled Jacob back onto his cot, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin. He was already drifting off, his breathing evening out. She sat on the edge of Samuel's cot for a long time, watching them sleep in the steady, unwavering light of the lamp. It was more than a gesture. It was a piece of himself he had shared, a piece of his own locked-up pain offered as a balm for her sons. That night, sitting in the borrowed light, she felt the last of the ice around her own heart begin to crack. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was starting to feel like a sanctuary. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep water. Lena knew this. She felt it in the way the silence had changed from an empty, echoing thing to a comfortable quiet filled with the small sounds of their shared life. The scent of her baking bread now mingled with the old smells of dust and absence. The house had started to breathe again. The harbinger of the world's return was a rider, a black speck against the pale, dusty blue of the sky that slowly grew larger. Lena was hanging laundry on the line, the wind snapping the wet sheets when she saw him. Her hands stilled. In this isolation, a visitor was an event and rarely a good one. She watched as the rider approached the house, not with the easy gait of a neighbor, but with the stiff-backed formality of official business. He was a man she recognized from town, Mr. Prescott, the banker. He was a man who dealt in ledgers and foreclosures, a man whose kindness was measured in interest rates. Elias emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He had seen the rider too. He walked to the edge of the porch and waited, his body relaxed but his stillness absolute. He was a stone wall, rooted to his land. Prescott reined in his horse, a fine, glossy black mare that looked out of place in the dusty yard. He did not dismount. He looked down from his elevated position, his gaze sweeping over the yard, lingering on the laundry line, on the two boys who had stopped their game to watch, and finally on Lena. His expression was one of profound disapproval, as if he had discovered mold growing on something he owned. "Thorne," he said, his voice as crisp as a new banknote. "I was in the area. Thought I would stop by." "You are a long way from your area, Prescott," Elias replied, his voice flat. "Business of the community finds its way to all corners," Prescott said smoothly. He gestured vaguely toward Lena. "It seems the rumors are true. You've taken in strays." The word hung in the air, a deliberate cruelty. Lena felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to gather her sons, to retreat into the house, but she found her feet were planted as firmly as Elias's. She would not run. Elias did not react. He did not even blink. "I hired a housekeeper, Prescott. That is my business." Some would say it is the community's business when a man of your standing compromises himself. Prescott pressed on, his voice hardening. "A woman of unknown character. With encumbrances. It reflects poorly. People talk. It suggests a certain desperation. A weakness." The confrontation was unfolding on their land, this small patch of the world they had begun to stitch together with raw thread. Prescott had brought the town's judgment to their doorstep, intending to tear those stitches apart. He was not claiming her as property, he was trying to reclaim Elias for the world of propriety and cold, hard sense, to remind him of a social contract he had seemingly forgotten. "I have found Mrs. Hale's character to be beyond reproach," Elias said, his voice still low, still calm, but with an edge of chilled steel now running beneath it. "And her work is satisfactory." "Satisfactory?" Prescott laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Thorne, listen to yourself. You are a man of property. One of the biggest landowners in this territory. You don't need to settle for this." He waved a dismissive hand that encompassed Lena, her sons, the clean laundry snapping in the wind. "Send her on her way. I can find you a suitable woman. A respectable widow from a good family." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The wind died down and the only sound was the nervous stamp of Prescott's horse. Lena held her breath. She watched Elias's hands, which were still hanging loose at his sides. Then she saw his right hand clench, just once, the knuckles turning white before relaxing again. It was the only sign of the storm gathering inside him. He took a single step forward off the porch and onto the dirt of the yard. He was no longer just a man on his property, he was a man defending his ground. "This is my home, Prescott." Prescott's smug expression began to falter. He had expected a man cowed by public opinion, a man who understood the importance of appearances. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding resistance. "This woman and her sons," Elias continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing Prescott to lean forward to hear, "are under my roof. And under my protection. What people in town say is dust on the wind to me. You have delivered your message. Now you can deliver yourself off my land." For a moment, Lena thought Prescott might argue, might push further. But something in Elias's eyes, a look of cold, settled finality, stopped him. It was not a threat of violence. It was the absolute certainty of a man who had nothing left to lose and had, impossibly, just found something he refused to let go of. But the moment was not only his. As Prescott gathered his reins, his face tight with fury and humiliation. Lena took a step forward herself. Samuel and Jacob moved with her, standing just behind her skirts, a small, united front. She looked directly at Prescott, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "We are not strays, Mr. Prescott," she said, the words clear and sharp in the still air. "We are a family, and we are home." It was a declaration, an act of defiance that stunned Prescott more than Elias's dismissal. He looked from her determined face to Elias's stony one and saw not a landowner and his servant but a fortress, a wall he could not breach. He pulled sharply on the reins, turning his horse with a spray of dirt. He rode away without another word, his back rigid with indignation. They watched until he was once again a small, dark speck on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the plains. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood, flapping the sheets on the line. The world returned to its normal sounds. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her knees felt weak. Elias turned to her. His face was still grim, but the coldness in his eyes had gone, replaced by something else, something warm and deep. He looked at her, then at the boys standing so staunchly beside her. "I was scared," she whispered, the admission costing her. "I know," he said softly. He looked at the house, at the laundry, at the life they were building in this empty place. "You didn't run." No, she thought. She hadn't. She had stood her ground. A shared look passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the battle won, of the line they had drawn together in the dust. The threat was gone for now, and in its wake, something new and strong had been forged in the fire of its challenge. They were no longer just two lonely people sharing a roof. They were a bulwark against the world. After Prescott's departure, the air in the house changed. The quiet that settled was not the silence of strangers coexisting, but the deep, restful peace of a battle hard won and a victory shared. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, the space between them felt smaller, bridged by the unspoken truth of what had passed. He had defended her. She had defended them. A week later, Elias came in from the fields at midday, an unusual break in his relentless routine. He washed his hands at the basin on the porch, the sound of the splashing water loud in the afternoon stillness. Lena was kneading bread, her hands dusted with flour. She watched him as he entered the kitchen, his expression serious. He did not sit. He stood by the door, turning his hat over and over in his hands. "The boys," he began, his voice rough. "They're good boys. They're starting to look like they belong here." Lena nodded, her hands stilling in the dough. "They are happy here. They need more than happiness," he said, finally looking at her. "They need a name. Protection that goes beyond my word to a man like Prescott. They need a father." The words hung in the warm, flower-scented air. It was not a romantic proposition. It was a statement of fact, as practical and solid as the stone foundation of the house. Yet, beneath the pragmatism, Lena heard the tremor of something else entirely. A hope so tentative it was almost afraid to show itself. "This is a good place to raise a family," he continued, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the endless horizon. "It's lonely, but it's strong." He looked back at her, and his eyes held a raw, stark vulnerability she had never seen before. "It is not what you might have chosen. I am not. I have forgotten how to be anything but what I am." "And what is that?" she asked softly. A long pause. "A man who would be honored to have you and the boys share his name." He finally stopped twisting his hat. "Lena, I am asking you to marry me." He had called her Lena. Not Mrs. Hale, not you. Her name. A simple thing, but it felt like he had handed her a lost piece of herself. The flour felt coarse beneath her fingers, the wood of the table solid. The world snapped into sharp focus. She dried her hands on her apron, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked around the table until she stood before him. She looked up into his face, into the winters in his eyes, and saw that they were no longer barren. There were signs of a spring thaw at their edges. "You are either the kindest man I have ever met, Elias Thorne," she said, her voice steady, "or the most foolish." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, the first she had ever seen, transformed his harsh face. "Can't I be both?" "Yes," she said. It was not just an answer to his question. It was an answer to everything. The next day they burned the old things, not with malice, but with a sense of ceremony. She took the faded, threadbare dress she had arrived in, the one that carried the dust and shame of the town, and laid it in the stone hearth. He placed beside it a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its paint faded. It was the last thing I made for her, he said, his voice quiet. She never saw it. He lit the kindling. They watched together as the flames consumed the dress and the bird, turning memory and sorrow into smoke and ash that rose up the chimney and disappeared into the vast, open sky. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And something new was. In the weeks that followed, the house exhaled completely. The white cloths were folded and put away. Lena's humming as she worked became a frequent sound, a quiet melody woven into the fabric of the day. The boys' laughter was no longer a surprise, but the house's heartbeat. Elias began to come in from the fields a little earlier each day. He started carving small animals for the boys, a lopsided horse, a sturdy-looking bear. He taught Samuel how to check a fence line, and he showed Jacob which clouds promised rain. The final image was not one of grand ceremony or public declaration. It came months later on a cool evening at the end of summer. The sun had set, leaving the sky a soft tapestry of violet and rose. Elias and Lena sat together on the porch swing he had repaired, its gentle creak a soothing rhythm. The air was clean, smelling of dry grass and coming autumn. Inside, the boys were asleep, safe in their beds. The lamp in the kitchen cast a warm, golden rectangle of light onto the porch. For a long time, they said nothing, just sat, watching the stars ignite one by one in the deepening dark. The silence was full, a vessel of shared contentment. He reached over and took her hand. His was rough and calloused against her own, which was no longer soft but was strong and capable. Their fingers interlaced, a comfortable, solid fit. The house stood behind them, no longer a hollow, haunted shell, but a home. It breathed with them, a quiet, steady presence in the immense, lonely heart of the plains, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest soil, with enough quiet care, a family could take root and grow. This story, it is not just about a rescue. It is not about a strong man saving a damsel in distress. No, it is quieter and truer than that. It is a story about the profound courage it takes to let oneself be seen. To stand in the harsh light of the world with all your grief and your baggage and your worn-out shoes and to not look away. It is about the quiet dignity of a man who has built walls around his heart so high he has forgotten the sun, who chooses to open a gate, not with a grand passion but with a simple, decent act. An offer of water. An unlocked door. A shared silence. We are all, in our own way, standing on a platform, waiting. Waiting for a train to take us away, or for a hand to reach out, or simply for the dust to settle. We carry our own pasts, our own sorrows that wear us down like stones in a river. And this story is a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of love are not declarations shouted from the rooftops, but whispers in a quiet kitchen. Mending a coat. Leaving a lamp burning. Saying a name as if it were a prayer. So here is your naming. Here is your reminder that healing is not the erasure of scars, but the choice to build a new life around them. To find another soul who understands that language, who sees the strength in your fractures. And if you are brave enough to stand your ground, if you are kind enough to offer shelter, you might just find that the loneliest places can become the most sacred of homes. You might find that what you thought was an ending was only the beginning of everything.